Hi, I'm Halina Rifai of A Sonic Hug, and I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them.
Should I say hi to you first?
Why don't you do, hi, I'm Wendy. Let's do one of those. We haven't done one of those before.
Okay, Kevin.
Okay. This week's guest producer podcasts on mental health. The podcast features people from Scotland who have been willing to share their personal stories related to mental wellness. The podcast is called A Sonic Hug, which is actually a really great name. And you hear the producer and host, Halina Rifai, explain a bit about the name's origin in our interview with her coming up shortly.
Yeah, and you'll also learn that A Sonic Hug is more than a podcast. It's a mental health safe space that had both on and offline initiatives before COVID-19.
It's certainly a unique podcast, I think, Wendy. I mean, mostly because of its focus on the people of Scotland. And you'll hear Halina note some of the cultural influences on how people think about mental health in Scotland.
True, the topics covered are universal, though, and quite varied. So you don't actually need to be from Scotland to get something out of A Sonic Hug. It could be dealing with a traumatic experience, managing loss and grief, grappling with body image, or learning how to get professional help or medication. The Sonic Hug gives space for a guest to tell a personal story while also providing the listener with some practical takeaways for a better understanding of the issue at hand.
If you're a fan of the Scottish band, The Twilight Sad, you might be surprised to learn that the singer of the band, James Graham, was actually a guest on an episode of A Sonic Hug. James, I think it's fair to say, boldly shares his personal story and reflections on his struggle with body image.
Yeah, it's a pretty tense episode, but one we highly recommend if you're unsure where to start with A Sonic Hug. If you're a music fan, you probably appreciate the challenges that performers face with creating a stage image and persona, as well as the role of social media in this.
You'll hear in our interview with Halina a bit of the story behind the episode of A Sonic Hug featuring James Graham. You'll also discover that the story had its beginnings in Hyde Park in London at The Cure's 40th anniversary gig in July 2018. Now, to bring that back to MetaPod, Wendy, you were actually there, is that right?
That's right, I was there at that show. I've seen The Twilight Sad a few times with The Cure. Robert Smith is a big fan. So yeah, it's great to see a musician be pretty honest about their mental health.
Okay, right. So enough from us for a little while, Wendy. Let's get on with our interview with Halina. Okay, let's start the tape.
Welcome, Halina, and thank you for joining us this evening to talk about A Sonic Hug.
Thanks ever so much for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me.
Perhaps you could describe your podcast in one sentence for us.
So A Sonic Hug are the stories of people from different walks of life who talk about how different themes have impacted their mental health around Scotland.
And how did you arrive at this concept for the podcast?
I had started A Sonic Hug, which was an offline and online mental health safe space, just through lived experience. And I really wanted to kind of give back to other people and community and so on. So I'd obviously been doing podcasting through music for many years. And a lot of people kept asking me, when are you going to start doing a mental health podcast? And I kept putting it off just because of time and so on. And so I just decided, I think because of my story, I thought, okay, if I can tell my story, then I think it's really important that people start to tell their stories as well. And that's pretty much how it kind of started. And it's been over a year in the making.
Podcast focuses on Scotland, was that correct?
Yeah, so it's people that live in Scotland. And I think that was fairly important because the network that I'm now part of, called The Big Light, which is the first kind of Scottish podcasting network, which is steered by Janice Forsyth, who's a broadcaster, Fiona White, who comes from television, Stuart Cosgrove, and so on. And They wanted to kind of centralise, they make sure it was from Scotland and it was Scottish voices. And there's very much the thing within Scotland that there's this kind of stiff upper lip and people just don't talk about their feelings and so on. And it's a kind of renowned, people joke about it, but there's something quite serious about it as well. So it just really, I really wanted it, not necessarily people just from Scotland that were born and bred here, but people that have kind of moved here and have lived here. So yeah.
Your own story is so deeply personal, but to get yourself into a kind of a space where you could tell your own story, which is both sad, traumatic, quite terrifying in places. I mean, how did you get your headspace into that, to just sit down? Maybe you did it over a number of takes, but to get into that zone where you had to go, right, I'm now going to tell my story.
So it took 49 takes for me to do that first episode. So
right, okay.
Just to give you an idea, I wrote everything down and it came in stages. So I wrote a first draft and I thought, this kind of maybe includes everything. But then I kind of changed it. There was something really quite difficult about it, obviously, because I spoke about my dad's pretty much at the center of it all. And I didn't want it to be just purely chastising another person. I wanted to show how it's a kind of generational thing with mental health a lot of the time, and how it can come from, so for example, the experiences that he had, and then that's kind of passed through to me, and then I don't know how it's going to pass on from me, but I wanted to I think that was the whole purpose of a sonic hug. And I wanted that to stop at me and then become positive from me going forwards. So, and I suppose that's a sonic hug as well, the meaning of the name. But in terms of getting myself into the headspace, really difficult, really triggering. I guess that it was, there were several times I had to stop recording. And I think just having to kind of relive and really deeply think about those times again was really tough.
And did you talk about all your family there? There's a number of brothers. Is there couple of brothers you've got?
I've got 3 brothers. Yeah.
So, you don't have to answer this. It's just my curiosity, really, because I think it really kind of forms that first episode. And did you essentially run it by them and say, I'm doing my Sonic Hug podcast. Oh, and by the way, the first episode is all about you lot.
So my 2 younger brothers, I didn't feel the need that I had to run it past them because they didn't really feature in it. So that was okay. But my brother, who's just 18 months younger than me, I had to message him because he features quite heavily. And he said, no, just do it. And then obviously my mum, I had to make sure that my mum was okay. And she listened to it before it went out. And she was remarkably, really positive. I was expecting a completely different reaction to it. But she said that she felt it was really important and it had to go out. So, yeah.
You mentioned the sort of generational transfer of mental health issues or struggles. And I think in your most recent episode, your guest speaks about this a little bit. So I was wondering if you see different things from people from different ages over the course of the podcast, and how what you think about that.
Yeah, it's there's become a common theme now. Anyone that seems to be over the age of around 60, I would say, is very much, they use the phrases man up, which I hate. They use that whole kind of, well, when we were young, this is how we had to do it. And we didn't have all this molly cuddling and cotton wool and snowflakes. They use all these terms. And then when you get to, I guess maybe about just younger, actually, just like, I suppose, even 50 and younger, it starts to ease a bit and it starts to soften the way that people speak. But men who are the same age, I guess, as me, maybe slightly older, certainly down to about, I'd say maybe early 30s. They've taken parts of that, and it's this pride that they cannot break through. They kind of let themselves become vulnerable for a few moments, and then they pull right back again. And there's this shame, and they just don't want to kind of show any more vulnerability. And even when the podcasts have gone out, I can feel them kind of retracting a bit. And going, yeah, I'm fine now, and it's fine. And I just wish that they would kind of, I don't know, I just wish that they would keep those doors open a bit longer.
I'm curious, what do you think has triggered that generational shift in as you said, men especially? There's a number of them in the interviews that say they dislike that man up phrase. But I'm just back to my question. Sorry. I mean, what do you think has triggered that kind of ability for them to be more self-reflective? Is it mass media? What do you think it is? I
think social media has been a massive impact. I think that in itself it's a blessing and a curse, some of the horrendous things that you see. But I think a few of them have started to really see the impact of mental health and how this really has taken its toll on people now. And they're starting to think, right, I need to break this chain now. I need to make sure that I make it better for the next generation. And I guess that even it's coming from a younger generation. So the younger generation are saying to them, well, I'm getting told this by my friends at school. I think that we should be more open. And so the teachings are coming from both sides. It's quite bizarre when it comes to that whole kind of millennial, Gen X, Gen Z. It's fascinating.
Do you think, with that all in mind then, that a podcast like A Sonic Hug could have existed even as little a time as 10, 15 years ago, just because there is this more openness now?
I think it probably would have maybe been a bit more controversial back then, 10, 15 years ago. And I probably would have got more of I would have got a backlash. I've not had a backlash at all with it now. It's been really positive. But I have had a couple of comments from older generation still saying, it can't be that bad. And I'm like, no, it really is that bad. How bad do you want it to be? So, yeah.
How do you find your guests? And, is it difficult to recruit people depending on their age or their issue?
So I'm lucky enough that I've known a number of them just because of working in the music industry predominantly, but they don't all come from the music industry, but it's various circles. But then it's actually been putting messages out via social media, through networks, through organizations, and asking for putting across different themes and saying, I'm looking for someone to talk about this and so on. But now, because of the podcasts, I'm actually not having to recruit because people are now coming to me, but there's a number of people and audiences and kind of groups and communities that I've got guests coming up that I still haven't hit yet. So that's really important for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, when people are coming to you now, do you have some kind of filter to say, okay, well, maybe your story is perhaps not as relevant or is not going to fit in with the kind of the flow of the other guests that you've had?
I would never say to anyone, I wouldn't want to kind of downplay their story or anything, because everyone's experience is relevant to them. I think that there's certain themes now that have become, I need to start kind of moving around and exploring different directions. So there's an episode coming up on eating disorder, binge eating, for example. We've got sexual assault, We've got drug abuse, alcoholism. We've got someone from prison who's actually still in prison, refugee. We've got a guest who's actually moved to Scotland, and just the impact of that. So I think it's just trying to really tell each other stories, just so that people can kind of really understand, walk a day in the life of in someone else's shoes, so to speak.
Is there anyone that shouldn't listen to your podcast?
Oh no, this is a funny question. Not funny, haha, just funny, weird. I guess I always put content warnings on the episodes that I say, and obviously I think that that's really important. And I think that if you do feel that it's going to be too much, then don't listen, especially if you feel that you are going to be triggered or you're going to be affected. But I would never say that it's not for anyone. I think that it's really important for people to listen. And I don't think that the problem with mental health is people still kind of sugarcoat it. They still try to put fancy pictures and memes on things. And that's what I kind of like about the podcast, is that it's pretty raw. So, and that was the whole intention. It wasn't to, make things more fluffy. It was to say, we've got a real issue here and we need to talk about it. So, yeah.
I think what you do very well, and I've told you this before, is that you allow this space for the guests to, occupy it and tell their story. And I think you probably do that through very good editing. But you sandwich that very nicely with summaries on either end. And particularly at the end, there are some very, easy to take away concepts that the person spoke about. And I'm just curious how your guests receive those. Do you go over that with them before you publish, or do they help you do that? Or how is that process working?
They don't know about that process.
Okay.
So this was another thing that I wanted to make the podcast unique. I wanted them to hear what my take was on it. And I always end with something that's really positive for them. And it's just solely for them rather than anything. It's a message to them to say, I think you're amazing. I think that this is what I've taken from this. But also, obviously, it's for the listener as well. Many of them don't want to listen back. Again, it's having to just kind of relive. And that's the hardest bit for a lot of people. But the people that have listened to it, I think they've been very emotional and they've received it really well. So I've been quite pleased.
Have they found it a liberating experience doing it? Or have they kind of gone in on themselves afterwards? You say that some of them haven't been able to listen back, but just the very process of regaling a story that's so emotional to them.
It's been incredibly positive, and it's been really humbling, that positivity from them. A lot of them are really grateful to have the space just to talk about it in their own way, for the length of time that they have, to someone that's just going to sit and not judge them, that is just really interested in that whole side. And I think that because I've been through all the stuff that I have, and they know that, then it's easier for them to open up to me. And that's always been the case. There's James, who is one of the guests, and he's spoken to me twice now, on a couple of music podcasts, and he really opened up about a friend's suicide. And then on this Sonic Hug podcast about his body image. And I think he was just so grateful just to tell someone that was outside of his family unit. And you could just see the relief, just not in terms of his physical, you could just see him feel a bit more relaxed. But I think just emotionally, you could see how long he had had that burden for. And it's really sad, because I know myself, it's like sometimes you don't want to go for counseling, you don't want to go for therapy. And even when you do, you just sit there and you're like, you have no idea what I'm trying to tell you. And sometimes it is easier just to talk to someone else that's on your level. So
yeah, you're a big advocate, and certainly many of your guests have been big advocates for therapy.
Yeah.
Is it something that you would explore, not yourself personally in therapy, but I mean, and perhaps at some point to bring a therapist on the show just to kind of give their perspective on some of the issues that you've had raised amongst your guests?
Yeah, most definitely. I think that it's really important. The one issue I have with therapy is that a lot of people have to pay for it. And if they want to have it, if they want it there and then, and I think that it should be free for everyone. I think that it should be able to be accessed fairly quickly. So I guess that by me, I suppose bringing a therapist on, then potentially that could even help people if I was to chat to them about having an honest conversation about some of the themes that we've explored. But yeah, ultimately, I do think, there's only so much, people say, it's really important to talk to people, talk to your friends, talk to your family, but you need professional help. There comes a time, and I think that everyone's got the human right when it comes to that.
You're quite involved in the music scene in Scotland, and could you explain the name of the podcast and maybe the connection with the music, I don't want to say industry, but I will ask if you think the music industry has in particular a problem with mental health issues?
Am I allowed to swear?
Yes.
Oh, great. The music industry is a shit show. I think it's got one of the worst. I think there's a total mental health epidemic. With regards to the name, going back onto the first part of the question, it was actually a guy called Ian Greenhill who he runs a company called Someone Says with a guy called Joseph. They do a kind of football program, but I've known him through music for several years. And I was looking for a name and I wasn't quite sure. And he said, what about a sonic hug? And I was like, oh my God, that is the one, that is the name. So I went with it because I think the reason that, because a sonic hug, we have got several things in the background that were ready to go before lockdown. We had a venue initiative where we had floor plans, exits, toilets, seating, where to sit and stand if you had panic attacks or anxiety, for live music and shows, because that's so important for people's mental health. Gig pals, so people were doing their first aid mental health certificates so that could accompany people to shows. And that was all part of a sonic hug as well. But obviously lockdown hit, so that I've sped up the podcast, which was really good. And then with regards to the music industry, I think that the fundamental issue is that people don't regard the music industry or music as a serious profession. So when it comes to finance, paying people properly, kind of even appreciating people's talent and work is not taken seriously enough. And it's just like, so I heard a really great explanation that someone said that it's like you're in a supermarket, you've got your trolley full of all your kind of important items, and then you get to the checkout, and then there's like the shelves that have got all the kind of extra bits on, and you just think, oh, I'm just going to put just something extra in my trolley. And that's how people think about the music industry. So I think that in turn, you start to go, right, okay, I'm not working in a serious profession. No one thinks that this is a job. And so that internalizes, it then has a knock-on effect. And, it's not funded properly, it's not paid properly. And I could go on forever about it.
Most of the vast majority of your guests could be fairly anonymized, but you didn't with the lead singer of the Twilight Sad. So how did you persuade him to be so open and come onto the podcast? And if you know, what was his process with being so public about it? Because I think, you know, it's very different. I'm not demeaning the issues that the guests have had, but it's arguably different for someone who is in the public eye to be so open about their mental health issues compared to someone who, I mean, I don't know whether they use their real names, some of your guests, or whether they are anonymized or not, but he clearly isn't. He is a public figure of a reasonably well-known band. So talk us through a little bit about how that kind of came about and his talking through of it, if you can speak for him.
I think there was a relationship of trust there anyway. So I'd done a podcast on Podcart, which is a music site I run.
Mm-hmm.
And I do a podcast called Life is Like a Box of Records, and you pick records that have soundtracked your life so far. And I was down at Hyde Park seeing The Cure, and we were in the front section, we were in the VIP section, and we were really lucky. And he had just come off stage, and he was with a couple of the other band members. And he was like, "Oh my God, you're here." So it's like, "Yeah, how you doing?" And he said, "Listen, it's after Scott Hutchison, who was the lead singer of Frightened Rabbit. And very sadly, Scott had taken his life, and James and him were really, really good friends. And James has said to me, he's like, I really want to come and do your podcast and talk about this and do it as part of Life's Like a Box of Records. So I was kind of a bit taken aback by that, because I just thought, right, okay, that's amazing. And I was so humbled. So I think that was the kind of start of it. And he did that podcast, and it was really upsetting for him. You know, there was a lot of emotion on it. And then I think when he knew the reaction to that and how people rallied round, then I suppose it kind of almost showed him that he was able to do something else. So I just messaged him and I said, look, I'm doing this new mental health podcast called A Sonic Hug, and I really would love you to be on it. And I gave the themes. So I gave social media, music industry, and so on. And he said, yep, great. But he didn't tell me what theme he was doing. And so we literally sat down, he started speaking, and then he started talking about putting on weight when he was a child due to steroids. And I just was in myself and I thought, oh my God, we're going down the body image route. And I just was not expecting it at all.
Right.
And then he really started to open up, and I found it so emotional. I think because I obviously have struggled with body image for since I was like 8 years old. But to hear a man like that, who you watch on stage, you listen to their music, I don't idolize him, no offense, James, but when we followed him. I've followed his music now for I think it's about 12 years, covering him and just as a fan as well. So when you hear and you're sat next to someone and they're speaking like that, it's two different people. It's the person on stage and then it's the person in front of you. And just that was really, it was really emotional. And I think the fans were just blown away.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask next, was what kind of reaction from the fan base of the band and, just that community around the Scottish music scene has been towards that particular episode. It's only a couple of weeks since it came out, the time we're recording this now, right? So
one of the girls, Christina, who is a very active part of that kind of fan group. So they've got fans of the Twilight Sad. They've got this mammoth Facebook group. I think there are like 2,000-3,000 of them. And I had messaged her and I was like, look, I need to give you a heads up. This is coming out. And I'm not really sure. I want to make sure that this isn't going to kind of fully trigger anyone in that group, or everyone's going to be okay, and so on. And James was so nervous about that podcast coming out. He was really worried. And so I was messaging him beforehand going, I'm here. If I hope you're okay, I'm going to check in afterwards. There was a content warning obviously put within the group as well. And they just came together so well. And it was amazing. And he has received what I believe to be a lot of support as well.
That's terrific. Yeah.
You mentioned some of the, I'll just call them offline activities of a sonic hug. And are some of those things that you're still doing, like a walking group?
The walking group was my favorite thing. So every Saturday in a park not far from where I live, we would meet up and just have an hour's walk around the park, just having a chat. And it was people that were struggling with anxiety, depression, and so on. After every single walk, everyone just felt a bit lighter, and it was great. And then obviously lockdown hit, so that's been really difficult for a lot of people. And that was that's one thing I really miss, and I'm hoping that we can start again soon, social distancing permitting.
All your guests have been Scottish so far. You're Scottish yourself. You work with a Scottish podcast network. Do you think, one, there is an opportunity, or you would like to get stories from other people in different either countries or parts of the UK, because their perspective on how they have gone through various, the hospital system or the therapy system might be different? And on a slightly lighter note, is there there was one of the guests who was talking about, it was a particular trait about the west of Scotland. I can't remember who it was, and I think it was one of the body image guys. And he was talking about how, this was the only time that I've laughed out loud listening to your podcast. And I hope you're not offended by me saying this. I was walking my dog, and it's when he's talking about he was driving his car and a couple of kids, and they shouted at him for having mad, crazy sideburns or something.
Yeah, that was Stevie Cosser. We've known each other since we were kids, and that's what I loved about that podcast, is that it was serious, but there was real humor there as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So with regards to taking outside of Scotland, I think there's obviously so much more to explore here still. I'm only coming up to my 9th episode, and I still want to go rurally. So I think that it'll be really interesting in terms of like Shetland, Orkney, northeast, and so on, and some of the islands as well, because obviously there's been statistics and studies about suicide and how it's far greater in some of these areas. And I think that it'd be really, because I grew up in a small town myself, and I know just the impact of that on your mental health sometimes. So I think that would be really important. But yeah, I mean, I'd love to start exploring and then start perhaps kind of going regionally round and seeing how the themes as you go around the country.
Where are your listeners from? Do you have a sense of where they're predominantly coming from? Is it from the domestic market, if we can call it that, or is it further afield?
So I've started getting a lot of listeners in the US, and which I kind of expected. I'd had quite a good listenership from the US anyway. Australia seems to be quite popular, Canada, and then a few European countries. So yeah, had my first listener from South Africa the other day, which was quite cool. But I'm trying to get more information with regards to that. I want more feedback from people from different countries to say, do you actually understand what people are saying, first of all?
It is tough sometimes.
Yeah. And obviously, do you know, how does that, I guess, like what your last question was, how does that maybe compare to where you are in your own experiences?
Would you say is the best environment for people to listen to your podcast? Now that you know that I've listened to all of your episodes when I've been walking my dog.
So walking is probably the one I would say. And I think when you're listening to it, when you're walking, it feels, I don't know, there's a different feeling to it. It feels more manageable. Both,
I agree.
I guess, emotionally and sonically. I just think that, outside walking.
I listen to other podcasts with the rest of the family around. I've got a wife and a couple of kids, and sometimes my wife and I listen to one in the car when we're going somewhere. But I think the connection with the deeply personal stories that people are telling makes it a very personal kind of listen, rather than some, oh, should we put a sonic hug on while we're making dinner? It's not that kind of vibe, is it really?
Yeah, no. And that's what I hope people get from it, you know, just something that speaks to them, I guess.
I really like the podcast, and will continue listening to the episodes as they come out.
Thank you very much.
I'm just wondering what's next for a sonic hug.
So I guess obviously as long as I get to the 10th episode, then great, without getting COVID or anything like that. But I just, like I said, I really want to kind of explore more stories. I've got one coming up that's really interesting with a guy called Cameron, who was misdiagnosed as a schizophrenic. And his story is unbelievable. It's like a film. So that one's episode 10, actually. Privilege is a thing as well. I think that there's a privilege that comes into being able to listen to podcasts and to have the technology to do so. And I really want to be able to let people that perhaps don't have that privilege be able to kind of tell their stories and listen to others. So that's certainly something that I kind of want to delve more into.
Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Huge thanks to Halina for the open conversation she had with us about mental health and wellness. As we all know, these are topics that are perhaps not so easy for many people to discuss.
Yes, and thanks to all the guests who shared stories on the Sonic Hug. That takes a lot of courage.
So, Sonic Hug is actually more than a podcast, as we said, and you can find out more about its activities and resources at sonichug.com. And you can also follow A Sonic Hug on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at A Sonic Hug, or one word.
Yeah, and if you're a music fan like we are here at MetaPod, you should take a listen to Halina's other podcasting work. It's largely focused on music. That's Podcart and The Culture Dive. We put links for you at the website, metapodshow.com.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll actually be getting out to some gigs again in the future, or not before long. So tell me, Wendy, what's the first band that you would like to see?
I'd really love to see Slow Dive, and funny enough, given that A Sonic Hug is from Scotland, I actually have tickets to see Jesus and Mary Chain later this year.
Good choice.
That's the Darklands tour, which unfortunately has been rescheduled twice now. What about you, Kev?
Yeah, so it's not a band or a gig in particular. Myself and my family meet up with some very dear friends every year and go to a local festival called Stand and Calling. That was cancelled last July, as you might imagine, and I think there's a huge question mark over whether that happens again. So, but fingers crossed, gigging will return, and maybe we'll even go and see a gig together at some point, Wendy. Wouldn't that be nice?
MetaPod staff retreat.
To a gig. I like the sound of that. Sounds amazing.
All right. So more amazing is what is coming to MetaPod next week, Kev. Tell us.
Okay, so the baton next week is being passed to Mark Thomas. He's the, for those of you that don't know, he's the British comedian and activist and presenter of another podcast which touches on wellness and mental health, very much like a sonic hug, but very, very different. Mark talks with medical and healthcare professionals working for the NHS, which is the UK's National Health Service. In his podcast, Mark Thomas's Lockdown Checkup, which was recorded last year.
And you hear quite a bit from Mark's 80-something-year-old mom and how it was for Mark to live with her during the first shelter-in-place order in the UK in 2020. If you like serious topics for everyday people served with a bit of humor, you'll appreciate Mark. So we hope you'll tune in next week for a few laughs.
We hope you do. So that's it for now. And we will see you
next time.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.